Hello, and welcome to The Charge Cycle, an electrifying new podcast on all things fleet electrification. I'm Todd Trauman, I'm the CEO of Emission Control. If you are a procurement manager, a fleet operator, or one of the millions of people tasked with a zero-emission deployment goal, this podcast is for you. We speak with industry experts, funding experts, OEMs, and many others to help you stay ahead of this enormous electrification shift underway. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Charge Cycle, a powerful new podcast on all things fleet electrification. I'm Todd Trauman, I'm the CEO of Emission Control, and today I'm here with Conner Whaley, our OEM and Strategic Partnerships Manager. We are both very excited to bring on Kevin Kushman from Electrada today. Kevin, he's got 20 plus years in the energy technology and utility space, including roles as CEO and CFO with firms such as Integral Analytics, Blue Pillar, and Current Group. He's part of the founding leadership of Synergy Ventures Corporate Venture Fund and co-founder of Clean Bridge Energy Partners. Energy technology firms led by Kevin have secured over $150 million in venture and private equity investment and have played an instrumental role in the transition of energy markets and incumbents to embracing distributed, renewable, resilient, and optimized resources. Kevin is a frequent panelist and speaker on topics ranging from fleet electrification to distributed energy and microgrids. Conner, tell us a little bit about Electrada before we get to Kevin.
Yeah, so Electrada was launched in 2020 to provide clean electric transportation for everyone and in every use case for North America. And through their 360 charging as a service business model, Electrada helps fleets across North America power their electric vehicles reliably and without need for capital investment. Now, Electrada also serves public, workplace, and residential organizations to power their electric vehicles for all of their residents, employees, and most importantly, accessibly and affordably. So I'm really excited to chat.
Kevin, welcome to The Charge Cycle.
Thanks, guys. Great to be here. Appreciate it.
Perfect. Well, we gave a little bit of a softball background on paper for you, but if you don't mind taking a stab at it yourself, give us a little bit of history of your background, kind of leading up to your initial involvement and work with Electrada.
Sounds great. Appreciate the chance to be here and to share a little about my background is almost to take a serpentine trip through a lot of energy technology, scar tissue, good things, some ugly things, but about 25 years or so since I was part of the utility at Synergy, which was a predecessor entity to Duke Energy. We started a venture group there, a corporate venture group, right in the heyday of kind of 99, 2000, when a lot of corporates from IBM to everyone under the sun was starting a corporate venture group. We started one to start exploring what energy technology would do to impact the edge of the grid, even way back 20 plus years ago. From that point, really kind of got the bug around being part of smaller emerging technology firms. Did some things on distributed power, worked in software at two different locations, worked on things like broadband over power line for a period of time at Current. But most recently, my focus has been around distributed power, enabling assets behind the meter to serve both their own native load requirements and reliability, but also to become assets upstream into the broader energy markets, which culminated in my most recent role prior to Electrada at Integral Analytics, where we took a look at the edge of the grid and how to actually do forecasting and work in tandem really with the utilities to try to understand what these new assets, whether they're solar, storage, EV, and other assets at the edge, how would they impact grid integrity? How would they impact pricing? And what would they do to the overall look of the grid going out the next 20 years? So EV was a big use case inside of our software development environment. And as a result, became really excited about what that use case was going to do once it started to gain commercial traction, especially with some of the more critical functions such as fleets, which is where our focus is today.
That's great. That brings us all the way up to your joining of Electrada and transition into mobility here. So speak a little bit on this, the origin story here for Electrada, if you can, and kind of talk about how it really came out of the Midwest. I mean, you guys are an Ohio-based company, right? But doing a lot of different work all over the place. So kind of give us a little more context in addition to what Conner gave us before.
Sure. The origin story is a little unique in that you don't think of EV, especially infrastructure and portfolio companies like ours emanating from the middle of the country. It's usually kind of starting from the left and working to the right. But our group started in late 2019 with a group of folks who have been in energy services, former colleagues at Duke Energy, and really a collection of folks that recognized there's just a huge gap. The market, it was then and continues to be very fragmented as it relates to charging infrastructure for all use cases. So the group of founding partners sat down and kind of wrote a business plan that said, what if we started in the Midwest with a build, own, operate, maintain model, and work to try to remove a lot of the friction points, a lot of the barriers to adoption in this part of the country, which lagged almost every other part of the country, and started going out and searching for initial investors to backstop that thesis. And we really did start with a let's get our feet under us mode. We launched the business in the first quarter of 2020, right as everybody was shutting everything down and going home. But fortunately, we were able to get several hundred ports under our belt as far as deployed in circumstances from municipal parking garages to university settings to destination charging, really just to get a sense of what it meant to actually design, build, own, and operate infrastructure with a high reliability requirement to our site hosts. And then to be able to translate that into other use cases that would require a lot more rigor as we approach the broader market.
Very interesting. So was part of the initial pitch to some of those investment groups to build this thing was that you guys were targeting really an EV and infrastructure desert in the Midwest and kind of saw an opportunity out there?
Very much so. So if you can think about maybe 1.5% adoption of new car sales were EVs kind of coming to that 2019, 2020 range, whereas you'd have 5 or 6, maybe 10x that type of adoption penetration on the coast. We really looked at across and said, how will we ever get a sense of what this could be unless someone stepped in and took the risk associated with the capitalization and really adopting the use case and trying to drive penetration a little more directly. So interestingly enough, at the same time, a lot of the OEMs on the EV side were building battery plants here in the Midwest. So the I-75 corridor from Michigan all the way down to Georgia is now populated with EV battery plants having been announced or underway. But the leakage in terms of technology was leaving the state of Ohio and the Midwest more generally. Our hope was to at least draw more attention back here and remove some of the barriers or intimidation factor to start seeing EVs on the roads here locally.
That's great. I mean, we know that fleet operators are not just located in California that are looking and being pressured to electrified at large. So love that story. Before just a couple more one quick question on just your footprint. So you guys, again, started in the Midwest, have good rationale for doing so and seemingly found a good market hold there. What does the deployment look like now? Where are you guys? What is Electrada covering?
So we almost think of it as a concentric circle plan for us. So we started here in the Midwest, most specifically in the tri-state area around Cincinnati, most notably because of our small size at the beginning and being able to get our hands around contractors and technology and just being able to see and touch all the site hosts and stakeholders that we were working with. And from that point, starting to build out more regionally around this part of the country. But then into the beginning of 2021, after we already had a little bit of a beachhead in terms of operating assets, started to transition the overall thrust of the business plan to be focused more on fleets. And that's the point at which we went out and pursued institutional capital behind the business. And we were able to hook up with our current financial sponsor, BlackRock's Climate Investment and Infrastructure Fund. And at that point, we were able to secure enough bandwidth and certainly capital capacity to start looking across the country. So we've transitioned, like almost everyone else has, to looking at California. It's obviously from a mandates as well as a program perspective, the most attractive and where most multi-site fleets are starting.
And it seems like your success is really because you are trying to solve the problem that everyone is trying to solve, but you're doing it in a way that really isn't capital intensive. You're taking that burden away from a lot of the fleet so that they can go and they can do what they do best, which is run their business. They don't have to worry about trying to finance electric vehicle chargers or figure out how to install them. They can hand that off to you, and you take care of pretty much everything. And with a lot of these fleets, what are these fleets actually looking? What is the kind of the biggest pain point that they're running into? There's so many different parts about trying to electrify. If they're trying to electrify, which chargers do they get, or how to install them? What, in your opinion, is really the problem that they're trying to solve, and what is that solution for you?
So it's kind of a loaded question, Connor, but if you think of it, that's why we call our solution 360, because if you look at the entire scope of what fleet owners are being asked to tackle, it's okay, guys, think about a new fuel type that has a pricing structure that changes intraday, far more volatility than it does between cycles or between months. New technology, new both on the driver side and on the infrastructure side. And then how do you interact with the electric utility for this core support of your function? That system integration requirement is being dropped at the feet of most fleet owners. And, again, no knock against the EVSE developers and technology companies, but someone has to help them through this. So we specifically go out with this system integration approach with capital behind it and address each one of those things. If you think about a pie chart, each one of those segments of the pie chart, from initial design, what does your use case look like? Not just from the early deployment, but how does it expand? Because that has a lot to do with the capital budget and the capacity planning at any one depot. And then how do we think about where this fuel price ends up relative to your current price of liquid fuel, and making a compelling case in an ROI environment so that they can start looking at price per mile being better each time they put their foot on the pedal, versus thinking about it as just a sustainability play. So we view this as sustainability with ROI from the very beginning, and that's why long-dated contracts is the structure under which we interact with customers, so we can lock in that price, remove the volatility. We own the technology and performance risk ourselves, and essentially they've just transitioned an operating expense for liquid fuel into an operating expense for electric fuel.
It's that transition from a capital expense to an operating expense that I think is the biggest, advantage to a lot of these fleets, because, when talking to a lot of fleets, especially with fleets that don't really know where to start, especially school districts, universities, smaller businesses that don't necessarily have the ability to spend 2 or 3 times more on chargers or vehicles, that this is kind of the solution where you're transitioning the big capital expenditure to something that they can spread out over kind of 5 to 10 years, and they can do so reliably, where, that brings up another point where, a lot of the reliability question for EVs is not just because the reliability of the chargers needs to improve, but the actual companies that are owning and operating the equipment also have to have an avenue to be able to repair them easily. And could you talk a little bit about, your approach to reliability, looking at how do you take the reliability aspect for these kind of longer term contracts? That's something that you guys do really, really, really well.
So it's a great point. And back to this idea of thinking about this as at least a decade-long relationship with this new fuel, especially if infrastructure is being deployed behind the meter at your facility, and what it takes to not just deploy the correct amount of capacity that's future-proofed as you add more vehicles to that location, as battery density increases or the mileage driven, the more the confidence is built with the fleet owner will increase. But it's also about what happens, how are tickets processed? How do you maintain that uptime commitment? Ours is a 99% uptime commitment, which is industry unique at this point. When you're looking at EVSE that typically doesn't perform beyond the mid-90s when it's doing well. In the public domain, we all know the study from Berkeley that talked about 3/4 of the charging assets in the field were operating to their standard. So our goal is to do very strong capacity planning, really own and know the load shape associated with that usage of electricity. And by load shape, I mean an 8760 every hour of every day for the year, what that load shape, what that draw from the vehicles, both individually and in aggregate at the facility, will look like. So we can understand what's controllable, what we can't control, and how that fits into the overall ability to manage those assets. And then, of course, having downstream partners in the field that provide us backstop if we need field service techs out to see something that can't be remotely rebooted or restarted. So it's all based on a heavy level of diligence that we, again, didn't see as available to the folks that were just looking to buy things off of a catalog list for equipment.
Kevin, speak a little to the technology that you guys are deploying here. So there's obviously a lot of interaction between you and your end customers on developing and understanding what those duty cycles are, what that load shape profile looks like for their particular facility. But there are a lot of customers out there that are maybe a little more prickly about what exactly gets deployed on site. Can you talk to them a little bit about, or speak to, is there a level of technology agnosticy that can be applied here? Are there a lot of different options for them? Do they kind of need to take it all as it comes from your group?
So what we do is certainly when we're working, we almost consider ourselves co-authors of the conversion strategy with our customers. So every location that's a candidate for conversion in the first wave and subsequent waves, we sit down and look at locational and temporal aspects of how they want to see this conversion occur. And then we bring forward the technologies that we feel most confident have gone through the vetting that we do, not just with our partners, but also in our own lab. We have a lab here in Cincinnati where we do software and hardware interoperability testing. We subscribe to things, that funky word testivals that's gone on in the space to see whose hardware can work with whose. Ultimately, for us, it boils down to two things. One is, will they backstop our SLA on the 99% uptime commitment? As close to that point as they can get from a technology perspective. Warranties are important. Response time on tech availability, tech team support is important. But secondly, OCPP compliance is a critical component of how we review technology. And 1.6 going to 2.0 and really embedding those smart charging profiles and being able to call those and choreograph charging is critical to what we do, because we ultimately own the cost of energy risk. We own the energy risk and the technology risk. So we are the customer, not only of the EVSEs, but also of the utility. So we kind of sit at the intersection of both power supply and how the technology works. So technologies that make it into our projects have been vetted through those primary two filters, in addition to just being great co-innovators with us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You guys are trusted professionals to vet and choose the right technologies, not just for the fleet's interest, but for your own. You need to ensure that stuff is up and reliably producing. So you had mentioned earlier before, kind of going back to this idea of being a solution provider on a lot of fronts to be successful in this electrification transition. And utilities have come to mind a lot. So a lot of these fleet operators are very concerned, of course, just generally about lead time and struggles with the utility and not knowing what to do about interconnection or how to even go about even the very first step of working with utility. But they are largely known, especially at least way out here in the West Coast, are largely known as the bottleneck in a lot of this. And I'm curious about kind of what your thinking is around what a utility's role is here, especially as it relates to your company and how you guys can work with them. So how can we work with them better, or how can we be better partners with them? Is that kind of an approach you take?
It's a key component of how we think we can bring risk and especially excess time out of our implementation and success schedules with fleet owners. So you mentioned, what role does the utility play? And of course, that's very jurisdictional. Some utilities are either slow rolling their engagement with folks like us, or even fleet owners just to try to get their hands around how they get regulatory recovery of the spend above the meter and be able to harden their grids appropriately to the load being added. Others, especially in California, has a long history of the CPUC and others, CEC, pushing the utilities to engage with distributed power, distributed resources, which has set the stage for it to be a much more robust environment to work as partners with the utilities. So as you guys know, many of the utilities, SoCalEd and San Diego and PG&E, have announced programs. They have rebate programs. They have fleet electrification programs that provide not just the incentives from an economic offset perspective, but also a pathway for application and queuing up your request, whether it's just a straight service request or it's something more exotic like an interconnection request where there might be some battery energy storage on site or the ability to dispatch back and help the grid. Ultimately, we believe that is more of an art than a science right now, and that's why we have distribution engineers on our team, why several of us come from that operating side of the utilities, because we realize getting in front of distribution engineers with a load shape, with a profile, with how our presentation of new load, which could be 2, 3, 4 megawatts of load at a specific location, could impact grid integrity at the feeder that serves that specific spot, is really important. So we understand what they look for, we understand the protection schemes they try to solve for, and ultimately helping us queue earlier into their evaluation cycle is a big deal for us. Plus, we want to be partners. We all want the grid to do well. We want it to be self-healing. We want to be able to manage this load and be good partners as the expansion of EVs happens.
That's great. Go ahead, Conner.
Yeah, well, and being able to take those kinds of projects, once you actually work with the utility is kind of that starting point. We always talk to fleets, and we're always saying, the utility is the first people that you should talk to. Because if you don't have electricity coming to your site, you can't really do anything past that. So when you're looking at where do people start, they have to start with the utility, and normally that first kind of step is, let's do a pilot. Let's go get one vehicle, let's go get one charger, 2 chargers, let's see how it works, and then once we get to that point, then we can start figuring out how to scale from there. That one point of getting to one or two vehicles is always kind of the biggest challenge, but we're actually finding that getting past that point, getting past that pilot, is actually probably more complicated than most people realize. How does a fleet actually get past that point? Because, if they're going to go from 2 to 10, it's going to be significantly more expensive. To be able to work with utilities, probably going to get more complicated. How do you see a fleet actually trying to, scale up that electrification effort that they started and actually get to the point where they can electrify their entire fleet?
Well, you teed it up beautifully, Connor. That's exactly why we're here. We want to step in between the conversation that the fleet owners believe they have to manage with the utility to talk about when vehicles are going to come on. Are we on the hook for a clawback against our incentives? Do we have to do something different on our property to accommodate a new line coming in from the street? All of that is incorporated into what we do to be the advocate for the customer with the utility. So part of our overall capacity design for any specific site with a fleet owner includes what we believe we'll be showing to the utility in terms of that overall load shape, not just for year one, but 5 years or 10 years into the implementation. So we truly align with the way the utilities plan their networks. They don't plan them a year ahead of time. They look at 2, 3, 5, 10-year load planning ahead of time, run their forecasts, determine if there are squeeze points, and then determine if they have to make incremental investments that could accommodate what the load will be downstream. And that's all part of their prudency review that they have to do before they go and try to find recovery for their spend with the commission. So what we do is perfectly aligned with how they evaluate fleet upgrade or feeder upgrades on their system. We just happen to be able to present them with our view within a statistical significant range of what they should expect for load. So our goal is to kind of be the human shield, as it were, for the customers so they don't have to take that on.
And I think that's why charging as a service models like yours are becoming so popular across so many different geographies across the world, because I know in Australia, that's one of the largest and fastest growing markets for charging as a service. And, it's growing at like 22% a year. It's growing really, really fast for this kind of market. And, and it's because it solves all of the problems that people are having. Exactly what you were describing with utilities is that these are the challenges that people don't really want to deal with. And it's starting to catch on in the US. And do you see that as being kind of the primary driver for charging as a service expanding across the US, that it's really, it's the market itself that is dictating that handing off these types of conversations with the utilities and everything else is really kind of the way to go? Do you see that expanding across the entire US or even globally?
I think so. I think we like to use the analogy, and it applies, I think, decently to this space of what AWS and Azure did way back when they were starting to move people to cloud computing. When you start thinking about buying server capacity and moving that away from having to own servers on your site, it's still a critical function, still IT connectivity, but it's using the existing wiring of the IT infrastructure globally to be able to optimize load and optimize price within a secure environment. We're doing something similar in that you're relying on an outsourced partner to basically manage all of the intricacies of managing this new type of infrastructure. And the commodity that they're providing in the cloud environment obviously is bandwidth. The commodity we're providing is electric fuel, but very similar. I think you're right. It's about removing risk. And there's a big risk shift that we believe is due to the fleet owners at this point. They've been trying to swallow all these different technologies, being asked to do a lot of things on sustainability quickly. But there's a lot of risk that it's just not exposed to a fleet owner or an operations team before they dip their toe in the water. We just think it's a lot easier to start with that story about what they want to accomplish first, and then understand what the ROI thresholds are and meet those as a fuel supplier instead of asking them to bite off the capital piece and the technology risk.
Yeah, and, that kind of makes me think, too, that while this can be seen as a lot of risk, it can also be seen as a large opportunity for a lot of other kind of different verticals or different professionals within any one particular organization. We're talking about electrification and electrons and energy markets and pricing, and not just diesel fuel anymore. And so it kind of feels like we have an opportunity here with this type of model to really empower other roles and responsibilities internally. So are you guys seeing that too? Are you guys seeing other involvement, other decision makers on the floor here, the CFOs of the world, trying to engage in this whole process and understand the nuances?
that we're engaging them purposefully at the very beginning. So it's natural that the entry point to any one of the opportunities we touch will come from fleet, or it might come from operations, transportation, or even sustainability. We try as quickly as possible to get to and with the financial decision makers inside of any of the enterprises we work with, whether it's a publicly traded company or a campus or an airport even. And the goal there is to understand their operational metrics and financial metrics relative to fuel, and then also understand relative to risk. So fuel obviously has two big components that drive what it does to your P&L. It's the outright nominal price, but it's also the volatility index against that. And as we've all seen, liquid fuels had a ridiculous volatility history over the last 2 years. Our goal with a contracted visible price structure is to remove or eliminate volatility, and also to peg it against a price that creates savings from the beginning. So they can actually, for the first time ever, the CFO can attach a number to fuel spend, at least for the EVs in the fleet, and understand that that's not going to move, that someone else is backstopping that risk. And as you've seen, public companies are either passing fuel risk down to their customers, which is a contributor to overall inflation and potentially anti-competitive from their perspective, or they have to eat it. And that's showing up as an uncontrolled expense when they have to go back to the street and talk about what happened last quarter when gas prices moved 30% one way or the other. So our goal is to get to that financial decision maker in the last mile delivery, logistics, any environment where fleet is a critical function.
Right. And I feel like you can expand even beyond just the financial elements of these companies too, right? I mean, having the CFO buy off because they understand they don't need the CapEx to do anything, and they might have a fixed overhead line item for energy costs is really attractive by itself. But there are some other groups in here too. I feel like it's just maybe at large for electrification when we're talking about workforce retention, talent retention, HR, kind of other training groups that can or should be involved in the very early days of some of the planning. So kind of going back a little bit all the way to your engagement with some of these companies and your ultimate customers and talking about load profiles. Do those engagements also include those groups? I mean, those engagements include the CFOs, but fleet operators, everyone else, or kind of talk about the engagement relationship a little bit more.
It's a great point. So we do stakeholder mapping for every opportunity that we start working on, and it ranges from the financial side, sustainability, fleet, transportation, operations, energy, as well as team interactions or HR. One great example is an early customer we had was Procter & Gamble here at a lot of their manufacturing facilities in the Midwest, and one of their early tests for us was, how was this going to be presented to the teams that were interacting with the infrastructure? And how would we handle that? And how would we message that against folks that weren't driving EVs? So a lot of what you might look past in terms of what may be called soft benefits or soft issues really were up front for them. And as we're finding out by building training programs and being on the introduction content side of things for the folks who are going to be interacting with the infrastructure, it's a big piece of the puzzle. Obviously, if people aren't comfortable at the very basic level interacting with new infrastructure, it just won't get adopted or won't get used the way it's designed. So that's another leg of the stool that maybe we overlooked initially in our zeal to get out there and start doing projects, but it ultimately will be the measure of success, is adoption and confidence.
It does feel like a recurring theme, ensuring that you have all the right stakeholders, all the right entities from the top to all the way down to the very bottom at the very early outset, just to head off a lot of those other potential electrification problems. Those are things that just didn't exist 15 years ago for a procurement manager that do now.
It's true. And so we have to be comfortable that we're going to find fleet owners, enterprises at every stage of the education path, and not go too fast before we make sure that everyone's been able to come around the table. So part of our learning along the way is to make sure that we've identified everyone who this decision will touch, and make sure we have specific educational content, specific comfort build for that individual, and to make sure that when they're sitting around making this quote-unquote investment committee type decision to go forward with us as a contractual counterparty, that there is complete comfort that this is going to make folks' lives easier rather than add things to their already busy plate.
Are there ways, so say a fleet does have a successful deployment with Electrada and they are off and running and very, very happy with the service, how do they engage with you guys after the fact? What other opportunities are there for them to build on what they currently have, or how do they participate with you in a different kind of more meaningful way if there is one?
So that's exactly how we start the conversations. And in some cases, like you guys mentioned earlier, there's a rush to try to get a pilot done, 2 or 3 sites, and then just say, plant the flag and, hey, we did this, we're trying EVs, isn't this great? But as we're happy to support those early moves and be as quick to the ball as possible, we also want to make sure that there isn't inefficient capital deployed. There aren't, the do something once and then dig 3 more times to try to make sure there's a reasonable expansion against that. But we talk about programs all the time. We enter into program strategy conversations with especially our multi-site, multi-jurisdictional customers, and talk about what are the drivers for adoption, either geographically or within their own individual fleet use cases, point to point versus inside a campus versus local delivery, that sort of thing, and map it out. So we do spend multiple different meetings and planning working sessions with our teams on the customer side to understand use cases, goals over the 5 to 10 year period, which actually gives you a nice blueprint that can always be tweaked and moved around as far as priorities. But it's thinking about the end in mind, starting with the end in mind, essentially, is where do we want to be from a carbon neutrality perspective, emissions reduction perspective, but also how do we want to gain control over our fuel spend ultimately?
That's one of the bigger questions of, where are you going to be in 5 to 10 years? Because these are not small deployments. A lot of these deployments, they're going to, some of the utilities, they require to, as part of some of these programs, to have data being generated for at least 10 years. And you have to share that data for 10 years. So these are really long deployments. And you have to kind of start thinking about that where it's not, you can't replace these every 3 or 4 years like some electric vehicles can. The charging infrastructure itself can span multiple generations of EVs and should span multiple generations of EVs.
With uptime requirements too.
And they have for 10 years. If you're looking at like a 99% uptime requirement over 10 years, that's only a few days that charger can be down for that decade. And that's, one of the requirements, and that's one of the beauties of, EVs is that we're starting to get close to that 99%. You guys are obviously hitting it. The industry is maybe lagging a little bit, but we're getting there slowly but surely. We're starting to hit that kind of uptime requirement. And that means that, we have that base structure. We have that kind of core infrastructure in place for this kind of mass adoption of EVs. And it starts with that charger that, potentially will still be there 10, 15, hopefully, even beyond. Where do you see that industry kind of going with that kind of longer mindset? We're starting to think about 5 to 10 years on the EV charger side right now. But as you see on the vehicle side, that the vehicles, the battery technology, the vehicle production schedules, all of these new models are starting to come out onto the market. That's moving much faster than what I think that the infrastructure side of this should move at. Where do you see that kind of interacting with the EV charging side over the next kind of 5 to 10 years?
It's a great question. So both on the price capacity, but also on the reliability side, it's a huge challenge, especially when as you mentioned, Conner, that the vehicles are going to turn a lot more quickly than the assets that serve them will turn by design. But we have to be thinking about excess capacity, building in that capacity plan for energized spares and what it means if we have battery capacity picking up against those same machines of 20, 25%, or even going the other way. If they decide to move vehicles to another location within the footprint, how do we adjust that and understand what their operational needs are there? So from our perspective, that's why electric fuel is the greatest catalyst for this entire conversion process. Because if you're a fleet owner working on a fuel contract, you're concerned about reliability, price, volatility, and expansion capacity. You're not worried about technology outmoding. You're not worried about vehicle cycles outliving the charging cycle or the charging equipment. You're thinking that, I have a partner here that's going to refresh and upgrade within our contract the capacity required to continue to serve fuel to my vehicles. And that's the mindset we think the industry should go to. And it's actually a disadvantage if you're selling equipment, even if you're financing it kind of on an equipment finance basis and providing a 5-year contract to maintain it. It's different than being a true continuous commissioning partner the way we are. And it's living inside the customer's experience really alongside them. And that's why we only get paid as the customer uses the network. So we're not getting paid up front. We're getting paid for a 10-year duration. So we think that aligns our interests really well.
And to be clear too, when we think about transportation fuel and electricity as transportation fuel, it can also encompass things outside of just class 1 through 8 vehicles too, right? For if there are opportunities to electrify other parts of the operation and get onto this network, I mean, it's an opportunity to include all of that with this type of product offering. Is that about right?
That's exactly right. So we think about multimodal opportunities within municipalities, e-hubs that would be almost a subscription environment that folks are out there trying to explore that business model where you could have public and private almost kind of as a designed or designated access asset within a certain municipal footprint or an urban footprint. We also see in heavy use distribution centers or warehouse environments the ability to have Class 8s, Class 1s, and yard tractors moving in and out of the same infrastructure. Back to the idea of a load shape, all of those present a completely unique load shape to the same asset infrastructure inside of the fence. And that means we have to be really crisp about how we look at capacity planning and either not way overbuild capacity and blow the cost of fuel out of the water or under deliver on capacity and miss the chance to pick up expansion potential. So that's a lot of the back and forth with our customers as part of the planning process.
Yeah, all encompassing the approach, it feels like, again, especially if you're dealing with the utilities.
It is, and it's a lot, and it's purposefully very diligent and methodology driven for us. And you might look at sales cycles like, oh, all that does is expand the sales cycle, and how do you guys keep churning and burning projects? But our goal is we want to see capital deployed over a number of years and returns against that capital over a multiple of those years of deployment. So we're not in this to sell, create margin, and then move to the next thing at all. So we've purposely been very quiet about getting out in front of announcements just for the sake of announcing things. We'd rather let the deals that we complete with our contractual structure speak for themselves.
Well, kind of on that, I was going to ask before we kind of bring it to a close here to talk about a project. Let's talk about one recent project that you are very proud of or had a lot of success with that could maybe serve as a good template for others out there.
Sure. So our first customer that we announced that has a multi-site fleet deal with us is Ferguson Enterprises. It's a large scale, over 5,300 vehicles across the country. They do national delivery, point to point, and then also local delivery for hardware supplies. So think about HVAC, plumbing, things like that. You see Ferguson vehicles all over the place moving between Home Depots and contractors and warehouses, primarily class 6 and 8 vehicles. So it actually was a little different than we thought we were going to be getting into at the beginning. But their use case was compelling because their route structures are very predictable. So we started with an array of California depots for Ferguson, and their primary goal was to make sure that the experience was a good one. They wanted to make sure that their drivers were confident, that their dispatch teams and their general manager of their distribution centers could handle these new vehicles inside the same facility without operational disruption, and then still see that predictable fuel cost reduction as more vehicles were brought into the depot to be electrified. So they've been a fantastic partner. We're really proud of it because it's not just adhering and a great first example of our model in a commercial setting. It's a multi-million-dollar relationship with Ferguson that only scratches the surface on what we can get done with them over the next 10 years. So like everything else with a new enterprise, it's about us earning our stripes and making sure that they're completely confident in expanding with us. But that's the first one. We have 2 others that should be announced in the next few weeks, one in the telecom space, which is going to be exciting, and one more in the campus space.
Well, it sounds like you really figured out that solution to how to bust through a pilot because, those projects do not sound like any kind of pilot that I've heard of before. So, it seems like a very scalable solution that everyone can definitely adopt.
It's hard. I always use the term airport lounge where you have a lot of pilots that don't go anywhere. We're
Especially
definitely
recently.
Oh yeah, but it's hard. You have vehicle availability and other things out of our control that are weighing on folks' decision making. So we're just trying to make sure when all the signals are correct that folks are confident in making that next step with us.
It's really inspiring, very, very interesting. Love this business model, love the concept, love the idea of having a very reliable expert at my side as I'm trying to move through this electrification journey. And so it's a very, very attractive idea, Kevin. So just wanted to wrap up, say thank you again for participating. If anyone is interested in learning more about Electrada, about you potentially, how can they get a hold of you or how should they find your company?
Electrada.com is the best way. We're on LinkedIn as well. widely available and happy to talk. So I really appreciate your time, Todd and Conner, especially for the great questions, because there's a lot of nuance here, and I think it's sometimes intimidating to get into detail that's difficult to cover. So I appreciate that.
Great. Thanks again, Kevin. Appreciate you being on the Charge Cycle. To our guests out there, thanks again for tuning in. We will have another podcast for you shortly, but until then, get out there and get plugged in.